Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read a lightly edited version of Pioneer Work in Opening the Medical Profession to Women. Autobiographical Sketches by Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, published in 1895. The book will be read in order, so if you would like to begin at the beginning, please start with Season 2, Episode 26. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at Exploration Dreamland. If you would like to recommend a text, please email us at explorationdreamland, all one word, @gmail.com. You can also find our episodes on YouTube. Please subscribe or follow and review us wherever you find us. Your actions will help others find us too. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. The following extracts from my journal of those days show how any early difficulties were successfully overcome. November 9. My first happy day. I feel really encouraged. The little fat professor of anatomy is a capital fellow. Certainly I shall love fat men more than lean ones henceforth. He gave just the go-ahead directing impulse needful. He will afford me every advantage and says I shall graduate with éclat. Then, too, I am glad that they like the notoriety of the thing and think it a good spec. November 10. Attended the demonstrator's evening lecture. Very clear. How superior to books. Oh, this is the way to learn. The class behaves very well, and people seem all to grow kind. November 11. Anatomy very interesting today. 2 admirable demonstrations. Dr. Webster, full of enthusiasm, told us of Godman, who was converted to phrenology by reading a work against it in order to cut it up. November 15. Today, a second operation at which I was not allowed to be present. This annoys me. I was quite saddened and discouraged by Dr. Webster requesting me to be absent from some of his demonstrations. I don't believe it is his wish. I wrote to him hoping to change things. November 17. Dr. Webster seemed much pleased with my note and quite cheered me by his wish to read it to the class tomorrow, saying if they were all actuated by such sentiments, the medical class at Geneva would be a very noble one. He could hardly guess how much I needed a little praise. I have no fear of the kind students. November 20. In the amphitheater yesterday, a little folded paper dropped on my arms as I was making notes. It looked very much as if there were writing in it, but I shook it off and went on quietly with my notes. Some after demonstration of a similar kind produced a hiss from the opposite side of the room. I felt also a very light touch on my head, but I guess my quiet manner will soon stop any nonsense. November 22. A trying day, and I feel almost worn out. though it was encouraging too, and in some measure a triumph, but 'tis a terrible ordeal. That dissection was just as much as I could bear. Some of the students blushed, some were hysterical, not one could keep in a smile, and some who I am sure would not hurt my feelings for the world if it depended on them, held down their faces and shook. My delicacy was certainly shocked, and yet the exhibition was in some sense ludicrous. I had to pinch my hand till the blood nearly came, and call on Christ to help me from smiling, for that would have ruined everything. But I sat in grave indifference, though the effort made my heart palpitate most painfully. Dr. Webster, who had perhaps the most trying position, behaved admirably. November 24. Today the doctor read my note to the class. In this note I told him that I was there as a student with an earnest purpose, and as a student simply I should be regarded, that the study of anatomy was a most serious one, exciting profound reverence, and the suggestion to absent myself from any lectures seemed to me a grave mistake. I did not wish to do so, but would yield to any wish of the class without hesitation if it was their desire. I stayed in the anteroom whilst the note was being read. I listened joyfully to the very hearty approbation with which it was received by the class, and then entered the amphitheatre and quietly resumed my place. The doctor told me he felt quite relieved. No further difficulty ever afterwards occurred. December 4. Dr. Webster sent for me to examine a case of a poor woman at his rooms. 'Twas a horrible exposure, indecent for any poor woman to be subjected to such a torture. She seemed to feel it, poor and ignorant as she was. I felt more than ever the necessity of my mission. But I went home out of spirits, I hardly know why. I felt alone. I must work by myself all life long. Christmas Day. Bright and gay with sleighs, the lake looks most beautiful, the mist rising from it in arches, the sky a brilliant blue, and the ground covered with snow. I received my Christmas annual with great joy, and having purchased 25 cents worth of almonds and raisins, I had quite a cozy time reading it. Sunday, January 16. A most beautiful day. It did me good. The text impressed itself on me. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on thee. I felt happy and blessed. Ah, if the Almighty would always shine on me, how strong I should be. The Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord will give grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly. The behavior of the medical class during the 2 years that I was with them was admirable. It was that of true Christian gentlemen. I learned later that some of them had been inclined to think my application for admission a hoax perpetrated at their expense by a rival college. But when the bona fide student actually appeared, they gave her a manly welcome and fulfilled to the letter the promise contained in their invitation. My place in the various lecture rooms was always kept for me, and I was never in any way molested. Walking down the crowded amphitheatre after the class was seated, no notice was taken of me. Whilst the class waited in one of the large lecture rooms for the professor of practice, groups of the wilder students gathered at the windows which overlooked the grounds of a large normal school for young ladies. The pupils of this institution knew the hour of this lecture and gathered at their windows for a little fun. Here, peeping from behind the blinds, they responded to the jests and hurrahs of the students. "See the one in pink. No, look at the one with a blue tie. She has a note," etc. Fun suddenly hushed by the entrance of the professor. Meanwhile, I had quietly looked over my notes in the seat always reserved for me, entirely undisturbed by the frolic going on at the windows. My studies in anatomy were most thoughtfully arranged by Dr. Leford, who selected 4 of the steadier students to work with me in the private room of the surgical professor adjoining the amphitheater. There we worked evening after evening in the most friendly way, and I gained curious glimpses into the escapades of student life. Being several years older than my companions, they treated me like an elder sister and talked freely together, feeling my friendly sympathy. Under the intelligent instruction of the demonstrator, anatomy became a most fascinating study. The wonderful arrangements of the human body excited an interest and admiration which simply obliterated the more superficial feelings of repugnance, and I passed hour after hour at night alone in the college, tracing out the ramification of parts until, suddenly struck by the intense stillness around, I found that it was nearly midnight and the rest of the little town asleep. I was equally amazed and shocked some years later, after dining with Mr. Walsh, the American consul in Paris, to learn that he had remarked that he could not look at my long slender fingers without thinking of the anatomical work in which they had been engaged. As the term drew to its end, there was regret at parting from friends I had made, and also anxiety from the uncertainties that still attended my future course. These feelings are expressed in my journal. January 21. I felt sad when the lectures actually closed. I received a curious friendly letter from one of the students requesting the honor of an occasional correspondence. It cheered me, funny as it was. Another student told me he had a daguerreotype room and asked me to sit for my likeness tomorrow, but I told him it had annoyed me so much to see my name in the papers that I certainly could not give my face too. Footnote 3. I was then very shy, and much annoyed by such public notices as the following. Quote, "A very notable event of the year 1848 was the appearance at the medical lectures of a young woman student named Blackwell. She is a pretty little specimen of the feminine gender," said the Boston Medical Journal, reporting her age at 26. "She comes into the class with great composure, takes off her bonnet and puts it under the seat, exposing a fine phrenology. The effect on the class has been good, and great decorum is observed while she is present. The sprightly Baltimore Sun remarked that she should confine her practice, when admitted, to diseases of the heart." End quote. Springfield Republican. End footnote. He said he had thought of graduating in August, but now he was glad he had not, as I intended returning to Geneva. Too funny. January 24. Went to Dr. Hadley for my certificate and attended the examinations. I suppose they were as thorough as most, but they were certainly not much of a test. Most of the students answered very well, but some very badly. Miss Waller gave me an oyster supper, and we had a very pleasant time. Mrs. Wilson convulsed us by an account of how she was actually struck down by the sudden braying of a jackass which she heard for the first time during a visit to the north, she never having heard the bray before. January 25. Attended commencement or ceremony of graduation, which, after all, was not so very formidable. When I went to wish Dr. Hadley goodbye, I found the whole faculty assembled and very merry at breaking up. They talked over my affairs, but gave me no important advice. To my great disappointment, no letters of introduction were prepared for me, but only a promise given that they should be sent on at once. I was very sad at parting from the Wallers, but had a pleasant chat with the students whom I found in the railroad cars. Passing through New York, where I dined with my kind preceptor, Dr. S. H. Dixon, and his wife, then living in the town, I returned to Philadelphia to try and arrange for summer study. Whilst seeking medical opportunities, I again stayed in Dr. Elder's family, and endeavored to increase my slender finances by disposing of some stories I had written, and by obtaining music pupils. Knowing very little of practical medicine, I finally decided to spend the summer, if possible, studying in the hospital wards of the great Blockley Almshouse of Philadelphia. This enormous institution promised a fine field of observation. I obtained a letter of introduction to Mr. Gilpin, one of the directors of the almshouse. He received me most kindly, but informed me that the institution was so dominated by party feeling that if he, as a Whig, should bring forward my application for admission, it would be inevitably opposed by the other two parties, viz. The Democrats and the Native Americans. He said that my only chance of admission lay in securing the support of each of those parties without referring in any way to the other rival parties. I accordingly undertook my sole act of lobbying. I interviewed each political leader with favorable results, and then sent in my petition to the first board meeting, when lo, a unique scene took place. All were prepared to fight in my behalf, but there was no one to fight. I was unanimously admitted to reside in the hospital. This unanimity, I was afterwards assured, was quite without precedent in the records of the institution. On entering the Blockley Almshouse, a large room on the third floor had been appropriated to my use. It was in the women's syphilitic department, the most unruly part of the institution. It was thought that my residence there might act as a check on the very disorderly inmates. My presence was a mystery to these poor creatures. I used to hear stealthy steps approach and pause at my door, evidently curious to know what I was about. So I placed my table with the books and papers on which I was engaged directly in a line with the keyhole, and there I worked in view of any who chose to investigate the proceedings of the mysterious stranger. The following home letter gives a glimpse of the Blockley life. August. Dear Mother, do not fear for me. I go on smoothly and healthily at Blockley. There is really nothing pestilential amongst the diseases, and I live simply, do my duty, trust in God, and mock at the devil. The matron is the only lady in the establishment, present company excepted, and I frequently step in to see her. She wears a nice white cap, has smooth gray hair, and soft dove's eyes like yours, and I sometimes look at her and think of you, till her loud voice breaks forth in fierce scolding, and then I think of Mrs. Beelzebub. She sits in an immense room in the center of the almshouse proper, and ensconced in her armchair, with feet propped on a velvet footstool, she dispenses orders from morning to night, gives out clothing, raves at the paupers, and dooms the refractory ones to a shower bath. She is a Quaker, very pious, I believe, attends yearly meeting regularly, and has an Episcopal minister for her only son. She is one of the strong-minded women, and manages matters to the entire satisfaction of the committee. I like to talk with her occasionally, for she is shrewd, and has seen much of life through dark spectacles. What a contrast she is to our head physician. When I first saw Dr. Benedict, I thought him the very loveliest man the Almighty ever created, and I still preserve my opinion. The tears come into his eyes as he bends down to soothe some dying woman, and his voice is as gentle, his touch as kind to each patient as if she were his sister. Then he is as truthful, energetic, and spirited as he is kind, so, of course, we are very good friends, though we don't see much of each other. I often send a thought to Cincinnati as I roam through the wards and imagine our contrasted employments. All letters unite in calling you the best, the most cheerful, most indefatigable mother that ever did exist. All her daughters praise her, and her sons call her blessed. How I wish you could pay me another visit this summer. Well, dear mother, heaven bless you. Write to me sometime. Your loving physician, E. At that time, and for many years after, the subject which those wards where I lived represented was an unknown problem to me. I was strangely ignorant of the extent and meaning of that phase of our human society which represents the selfish relations of men and women. This semi-blindness, however, proved a real safeguard to me through the many unusual experiences of my subsequent life. It was not until 1869, when attending the Social Science Congress in Bristol, that my mind at last fully comprehended the hideousness of modern fornication. But my residence at Blockley prepared my mind to some extent for later revelations, as is shown by entries in my journal. June 22. I had a long talk with Nurse Welch on the patients in her departments, which impressed me deeply. Most of the women are unmarried, a large proportion having lived at service and been seduced by their masters, though, on the whole, about as many seducers are unmarried as married. I found no instance of a married woman living with her husband entering. This morning, one young woman tried to escape from Blockley by tying sheets together and fastening them outside the window bars. But they giving way, she fell down from the 3rd story and was picked up suffering from concussion of the brain and other injuries. All this is horrible. Women must really open their eyes to it. I am convinced that they must regulate this matter. But how? August 17. Drank tea with the matron and had a very pleasant time. She excites me, and I influence her. She actually apologized to me for her rough and tyrannical treatment of one of the women. August 19. A beautiful thought came to me this lovely morning. Emerson says, quote, "Our faith comes to us in moments. Our vice is habitual." End quote. I never till now could explain this to my satisfaction. It is that the atmosphere of our society, of our daily surroundings is false. It attracts the demons. They encompass us continually, for we live in their home. The angels have to strive to come to us. But when by a holy inspiration, or an effort of man's nobler nature, he rises to a purer sphere, then the angels throng lovingly round him. He breathes the divine life. But the moment this effort is relaxed, he, not living in a heavenly atmosphere, naturally and inevitably sinks again into hell, because his present home is there, for he cannot separate himself from the race. Not till the race is redeemed will our habitual state be heavenly and the true spontaneous divine life be possible. This is the philosophy of effort. The solidarity of our race asserts the impossibility of our present, permanent, divine life. Bless God for our deep momentary experiences, our prophetic assurances. This sweet morning refreshes me inexpressibly. The wind that lifts my hair seems filled with angel hands that soothe the soul to peace. That little warbling bird fills me with holy joy. A glory seems to rest everywhere, a tide from the divine nature. During my residence at Blockley, the medical head of the hospital, Dr. Benedict, was most kind and gave me every facility in his power. I had free entry to all the women's wards and was soon on good terms with the nurses. But the young resident physicians, unlike their chief, were not friendly. When I walked into the wards, they walked out. They ceased to write the diagnosis and treatment of patients on the card at the head of each bed, which had hitherto been the custom, thus throwing me entirely on my own resources for clinical study. During the summer of 1848, the famine fever was raging in Ireland. Multitudes of emigrants were attacked with fever whilst crossing the ocean, and so many were brought to Blockley that it was difficult to provide accommodation for them, many being laid on beds on the floor. But this terrible epidemic furnished an impressive object lesson, and I chose this form of typhus as the subject of my graduation thesis, studying in the midst of the poor dying sufferers who crowded the hospital wards. I read my thesis to Dr. Elder and was greatly encouraged by his hearty approbation. Trying as my painful residence at Blockley had been both to body and mind, I was conscious of the great gain in medical knowledge and worldly experience which it had afforded. The following journal entry expresses the mixed feelings with which that strange residence was left. September 22. My last evening at Blockley. Here I sit writing by my first fire. How glad I am, tomorrow, I go home to my friends. And yet, as I watched the beautiful sunset from my great windows, as little Marianne pays her willing attendance, and all seems so friendly, as I walked to Dr. Benedict's with my thesis, and felt the entrancing day and the lovely country, I almost regretted that I was going to leave. Heaven guide me, may good spirits ever surround me. At the end of the summer, I gladly returned to the healthy and hopeful college life at Geneva. Passing through New York, where I saw Dr. Dixon and his family and heard Henry Ward Beecher preach, I reached my winter's home on October 3, reported myself at college, met everywhere a kind welcome, and settled down for winter work. The clever demonstrator again afforded me his valuable aid in anatomy, and the friendliness of the class continued. Sometimes, whilst sitting by the doctor during some delicate demonstration of the brain, the students who were crowding round, standing on chairs, leaning on one another's shoulders, kept most respectfully from me, drawing back instantly when by accident they touched my head or shoulder. Footnote 4. Appendix 1. The following letter, lately published in the New York Church Union by a well-known physician of New York, is interesting as the testimony of a gentleman who was a fellow student in the Geneva Medical College. The Medical Co-Education of the Sexes by Stephen Smith, M.D. Medical circles were recently entertained by a symposium of prominent physicians discussing the propriety of the medical co-education of the sexes. All of the writers were opposed to the suggestion. Some, notably Dr. Weir Mitchell of Philadelphia, expressed the utmost disgust at the proposition. It happened to me to have witnessed the first instance of the co-education of medical students of both sexes in this country, and the results quite upset the theories of these gentlemen. The first course of medical lectures which I attended was in a medical college in the interior of this state in 1847 and 48. The class, numbering about 150 students, was composed largely of young men from the neighboring towns. They were rude, boisterous, and riotous beyond comparison. On several occasions, the residents of the neighborhood sent written protests to the faculty, threatening to have the college indicted as a nuisance if the disturbance did not cease. During lectures, it was often almost impossible to hear the professors, owing to the confusion. Some weeks after the course began, the dean appeared before the class with a letter in his hand, which he craved the indulgence of the students to be allowed to read. Anticipation was extreme when he announced that it contained the most extraordinary request which had ever been made to the faculty. The letter was written by a physician of Philadelphia who requested the faculty to admit as a student a lady who was studying medicine in his office. He stated that she had been refused admission by several medical colleges, but as this institution was in the country, he thought it more likely to be free from prejudice against a woman medical student. The dean stated that the faculty had taken action on the communication and directed him to report their conclusion to the class. The faculty decided to leave the matter in the hands of the class with this understanding, that if any single student objected to her admission, a negative reply would be returned. It subsequently appeared that the faculty did not intend to admit her, but wished to escape direct refusal by referring the question to the class, with a proviso which, it was believed, would necessarily exclude her. But the whole affair assumed the most ludicrous aspect to the class, and the announcement was received with the most uproarious demonstrations of favor. A meeting was called for the evening, which was attended by every member. The resolution approving the admission of the lady was sustained by a number of the most extravagant speeches which were enthusiastically cheered. The vote was finally taken with what seemed to be one unanimous yell, "Yea." When the negative vote was called, a single voice was heard uttering a timid "No." The scene that followed passes description. A general rush was made for the corner of the room which emitted the voice, and the recalcitrant member was only too glad to acknowledge his error and record his vote in the affirmative. The faculty received the decision of the class with evident disfavor and returned an answer admitting the lady student. 2 weeks or more elapsed, and as the lady student did not appear, the incident of her application was quite forgotten, and the class continued in its riotous career. One morning, all unexpectedly, a lady entered the lecture room with the professor. She was quite small of stature, plainly dressed, appeared diffident and retiring, but had a firm and determined expression of face. Her entrance into that bedlam of confusion acted like magic upon every student. Each hurriedly sought his seat, and the most absolute silence prevailed. For the first time, a lecture was given without the slightest interruption, and every word could be heard as distinctly as it would if there had been but a single person in the room. The sudden transformation of this class from a band of lawless desperadoes to gentlemen by the mere presence of a lady proved to be permanent in its effects. A more orderly class of medical students was never seen than this, and it continued to be to the close of the term. The real test of the influence of a woman upon the conduct and character of a man in coeducation was developed when the professor of anatomy came to that part of his course which required demonstrations that he believed should be witnessed only by men. The professor was a rollicking, jovial man who constantly interspersed his lectures with witty remarks and funny anecdotes. Nor did he study to have his language chaste, or the moral of his stories pure and elevating. In fact, vulgarity and profanity formed a large part of his ordinary lectures, and especially was this true of the lectures on the branch of anatomy above mentioned. On this account, chiefly, he was exceedingly popular with his class, and during his lectures, stamping, clapping, and cheering were the principal employments of the students. One morning, our lady student was missed at the lecture on anatomy, and the professor entered the room evidently laboring under great excitement. He stated that he had a communication to make to the class which demanded the most serious consideration. He then explained that he had thought it highly improper that the lady student should attend certain lectures specially adapted for men, and as he was approaching that subject, he had frankly advised her to absent herself in a letter which he read. He dwelt upon the indelicacy of the subject, the embarrassment under which he should labor if a lady were present, and the injustice which would be done to the class by the imperfect manner in which he should be obliged to demonstrate the subject. He closed by offering her abundant private opportunities for study and dissection. He then read her reply. It was gracefully written and showed a full appreciation of his embarrassing position when viewed from the low standpoint of impure and unchaste sentiments. But she could not conceive of a medical man whose mind was not so elevated and purified by the study of the science of anatomy that such sentiments would for a moment influence him. Coming to the practical question of her attendance upon these lectures, she stated that if the professor would really be embarrassed by the presence of a lady on the first tier of seats, she would take her seat on the upper tier, and she trusted that his interest in his subject would lead him to entirely forget the presence of student number 130, her registered number. At the close of the letter, the professor acknowledged the justice of the rebuke which he had received, and declared that a lady who was animated by such elevated views of her profession was entitled to every possible encouragement which the class or faculty could give. He then opened the door, and she entered, only to receive an ovation of the most overwhelming character. The lectures on anatomy proceeded in regular order to their conclusion, and it was the universal testimony of the oldest students that they had never listened to such a complete and thorough course. At the close of the term, our lady student came up for examination for graduation and took rank with the best students of the class. As this was the first instance of the granting of a medical diploma to a woman in this country, so far as the faculty had information, there was at first some hesitation about conferring the degree. But it was finally determined to take the novel step, and in the honor list of the roll of graduates for that year appears the name, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. Church Union, New York, 1892. End footnote. October 26. The class held a meeting today to request a holiday on Election Day, and a political division was called for by the assembled students. I went over to the Free Soil side and was received with repeated cheering. I asked Dr. Leford reproachfully if he was going to vote for the slaveholder, Taylor, whereupon he gave me his reasons for political action and grew quite eloquent in his self-defense. November 12. Howie made his appearance today, just as I settled down to perpetrate an essay for the family Christmas annual. How good it is to see a brother! He looked very well, and we had a merry time together. I stayed away from afternoon lectures to be with him. He is a capital companion, and greatly improved. I did more laughing than I've done for months. His visit did me real good, for I have been so lonely. Heaven bless the dear boy in his future. Sunday, 19th. Alone all day in my room, yet anything but lonely. Bright visions of usefulness have been floating around me. I consecrated myself anew to the accomplishment of a great idea. I tried to lecture for an hour to an imaginary audience, striving to prepare for work by seeking expression for my thoughts. I would I were not so exclusively a doer. Speech seems essential to the reformer, but mine is at present a very stammering, childish utterance. 26th. Went to church. Mr. Hogarth said some true things. He drew our thoughts to the reformers of old, with their sublime trust in the Most High. With a strange feeling of pleasure, I claimed kindred with Asa, king of Judah, who broke the idols of the people and overcame the hosts of the Ethiopians. November 30. Our evening lecture broke up in a political hurrah for a Whig orator, and John Van Buren were both speaking in the town, and the students rushed to attend the political meetings. I again discussed the subject with Dr. Leford, he justifying himself enthusiastically for being a Whig. He talked well, but I grew tired of those old expediences. By this time, the genuine character of my medical studies was fully established. Had I been at leisure to seek social acquaintance, I might have been cordially welcomed. But my time was anxiously and engrossingly occupied with studies and the approaching examinations. I lived in my room and my college, and the outside world made little impression on me. Extracts from the Journal. December 22. the deepest snow I have seen for years. It was as much as I could do to walk to college, but all was pleasant. The class seemed so very friendly. One set me a chair, another spoke so pleasantly, and I had several little friendly chats. How little they know my sensitiveness to these trifling tokens. The unusual weather, an alarm of fire, Dr. Webster's arrival, were so many points for sociability. December 31. The New Year's Eve. Alone, as usual, I spent the day. At night, as I watched the last moments of the year slowly depart, a deep solemnity came over me. A hopeless sorrow for poor humanity. I seemed to hear the heavy resounding bell of time, tolling mournfully the dying year, whilst angels with covered faces and forms that bent with sorrow waited to receive the finishing scroll of the world's existence, that the fearful record guarded in darkness and silence might at last be unrolled in the terrible light of eternity. January 1. Stayed quietly in my room, whilst the merry sleigh bells and gay voices rang without. 11th. I called to see the pretty blind girl operated on this morning. She was all alone in the hotel, her friends far away. Poor child, she has no protector, within or without. She asked me who the student was that brought her home, when college would be out, etc. Her simple heart and idle fancy are soon caught. Such are the women I long to surround with my stronger arm. Alas, how almost hopeless does the task seem! But God is omnipotent. January 19. Dear M, I sit down to try and quiet myself by writing to you, for this morning I, as first on the list of candidates, passed through the usual examinations, presented my certificates, received the testimony of satisfaction from the faculty, whose recommendation will procure me the diploma next Tuesday. Now, though the examinations were not very formidable, still the anxiety and effort were as great as if everything were at stake, and when I came from the room and joined the other candidates who were anxiously awaiting their turn, my face burned, my whole being was excited, but a great load was lifted from my mind. The students received me with applause. They all seemed to like me, and I believe I shall receive my degree with their united approval. A generous and chivalric feeling having conquered any little feelings of jealousy. I often feel when I am with them how beautiful the relations of man and woman might be under a truer development of character in nobler circumstances. I do not know the moral character of any one of our students, for I have no genius for hunting up the darker parts of a person's soul. But I know that Geneva is a very immoral place, the lower classes of women being often worthless, the higher ones fastidious and exclusive, so that there is no healthy blending of the sexes. But notwithstanding the bad associations in which they may have been brought up, I have never had any difficulty in giving the right tone to our intercourse. I am more convinced than ever that Fourier is right in placing this matter in the hands of women, and my hope rises when I find that the inner heart of the human being may still remain pure, notwithstanding some corruption of the outer coverings. I don't know if I've ever told you how deep this matter of licentiousness has gradually sunk into my soul, and that the determination to wage a war of extermination with it strengthens continually, and the hope of gaining power and experience to do it worthily is one of my strongest supports in action. So help me God, I will not be blind, indifferent, or stupid in relation to this matter, as are most women. I feel specially called to act in this reform when I have gained wisdom for the task. The world can never be redeemed till this central relation of life is placed on a truer footing. But I meant to talk to you about the cholera. Our physicians confessedly cannot cure it. The professor who lectured upon it yesterday commenced, "Gentlemen, I wish I could tell you how to cure the cholera, but under all modes of treatment the mortality seems to be the same. However, I will tell you something of the disease and what I would do if called to a case." The cordial relations with professor and students continued. Throughout the examination time, the most friendly interest was felt in my success by my fellow students. One of my brothers came on to Geneva to attend my graduation. Being personally a stranger to the students, he was much amused by the free indications of friendly comradeship which he overheard. The ceremony of conferring the full and equal diploma of Doctor of Medicine upon a woman excited much interest in the neighborhood. It was held in the large Presbyterian church, which, with its ample galleries, was crowded in every part with spectators. The other students walked in procession from the college to the church, but I went up with my brother and took my seat in the side aisle. Extracts from the Journal of 1849. January 22. Our examinations came off successfully. Hurrah, 'tis almost over. Tuesday, January 23, 1849. The day, the grand day, is nearly finished, and now, whilst visitors are dropping in, I must record my first entrance into public life. 'Twas bright and beautiful and very gratifying. Great curiosity was felt. As I entered and sat in the church, I gave one thought to friends, and then thought only of the Holy One. After the degree had been conferred on the others, I was called up alone to the platform. The president, in full academical costume, rose as I came on the stage, and, going through the usual formula of a short Latin address, presented me my diploma. I said, "Sir, I thank you. It shall be the effort of my life, with the help of the Most High, to shed honor on my diploma." The audience applauded, but their presence was little to me. I was filled with a sense of the grandeur of a holy life, with high resolves for the future. As I came down, George Field opened the door of the front row, and I was much touched by the graduates making room for me, and insisting that I should sit with them for the remainder of the exercises. Most gladly I obeyed the friendly invitation, feeling more thoroughly at home in the midst of these true-hearted young men than anywhere else in the town. I heard little of what was said. My whole soul was absorbed in heavenly communion. I felt the angels around me. Dr. Lee gave the valedictory address. He surprised me by the strong and beautiful way in which he alluded to the event. I felt encouraged, strengthened to be greatly good. As I stood at the door, the faculty all most kindly wished me goodbye, and Dr. Hale and Bishop Delancey shook hands and congratulated me. All the ladies collected in the entry and let me pass between their ranks, and several spoke to me most kindly. For the next few hours, before I left by train, My room was thronged by visitors. I was glad of the sudden conversion thus shown, but my past experience had given me a useful and permanent lesson at the outset of life as to the very shallow nature of popularity. Stay tuned for the next segment from Pioneer Work in Opening the Medical Profession to Women by Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find this and many other interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.